Under the flat skies of Nebraska, there was one field that unsettled every eye that passed it. Even in the heat of summer, when the prairie shimmered with warmth, its soil remained dark and cold to the touch, as if the sun refused to rest there. Crows circled it in silence but rarely landed, and cattle driven too near pulled away nervously, hooves digging into the earth as if they sensed something men should not disturb. Neighbors muttered that nothing wholesome had ever taken root there. Seeds rotted before sprouting, stalks grew twisted and stunted, and vegetables that managed to push through were misshapen and bitter. It was as if the land rejected the idea of feeding human mouths, carrying instead some hidden appetite of its own. Yet one man insisted the land could be coaxed into life. Henry Kessler walked those acres with a devotion that looked almost holy, pressing his palms into the dirt as if listening for its pulse. To his neighbors, he was a humble farmer, a widower who carried himself with quiet dignity and offered steady help during harvest. He would lend a mule without question, fix a broken fence without pay, and bow his head longer than anyone during Sunday prayers. His voice was soft, his eyes gentle, and people said misfortune had only made him more kind. They never noticed how he stood a little too long over the earth, whispering things no one else could hear, or how his lips moved as though answering a voice buried deep below. Henry's land sat on the edge of town where no other farmer wanted to plant. Families called it blighted, a cursed patch that swallowed hope. Still, Henry claimed he had found a way. He told others that patience and faith would let the soil heal, that nothing was beyond redemption if tended with care. But what he did not share was the secret he carried, a method of feeding the earth in ways that made crops rise green and tall, only in his rows while weeds strangled everywhere else. Townsfolk marveled quietly at how Henry's corn stood proud when theirs faltered, though no one asked too deeply how he achieved it. Farmers preferred to believe he had simply been blessed, and Henry let them believe, smiling softly, while in his heart he knew blessings had nothing to do with it. The truth was that Henry never saw himself as a farmer of food, but as a farmer of the unseen. To him, the soil was not dead, it was hungry. And hunger could be guided, reshaped, and turned into growth if one was willing to give it what it wanted. He had learnt this as a boy when a stray dog fell into one of his father's wells and lay rotting for days. That year vines grew thickest near the pit, their fruits swollen and dark. The image stayed with him like a scripture no church would ever read aloud. Over time, Henry came to believe that flesh and spirit pressed back into the ground could awaken a strength the sun could not summon. The soil that never warmed did not frighten him, it invited him. It was his altar, and he was its chosen keeper. When Henry walked into town, people saw a man weathered by loss, dressed in worn boots and a clean but faded shirt. They spoke of him kindly, calling him dependable, trustworthy, and someone who had suffered much but never turned bitter. What they could not see was how every chore, every handshake, every bowed head in prayer was part of a mask he had worn so long it felt like skin. His life was built on balance, the perfect blend of visible innocence and secret devotion to the soil's darker hunger. His neighbors admired his selflessness, never knowing that every act of kindness only deepened his camouflage, ensuring that no one would look too closely at what was happening in the field beyond the hedgerows. Seasons turned, and each year Henry's fields produced just enough to prove him right. His neighbors continued to mutter about their bad luck while praising Henry's fortune, and still they overlooked the truth. They saw a man in harmony with God's creation when in fact Henry served a different master, one that lived in the black silence beneath their feet. The soil that never warmed had found its farmer, and through Henry Kessler, it was only beginning to grow. Henry Kessler's name carried weight in the small Nebraska town, though not for power or wealth. His weight was gentler, quieter, the kind that earned respect by small deeds repeated over years. If a neighbor's ox pulled lame, Henry appeared at the fence with a rope and a steady hand. When a widow's roof sagged under the snow, he climbed the ladder with his hammer before dawn. Even the hungry drifters who stumbled off the rail line knew they could knock on Henry's door and be given bread and stew, a warm seat at his table and a prayer over the meal. His kindness was so consistent, so unwavering, that people began to see him as a man without flaw, a God-fearing soul carved out of tragedy and shaped into virtue. They did not notice that each gesture, each soft word was not spontaneous but calculated, arranged with care like pieces in a design only he could see. Beneath that calm face, something colder grew. Henry never acted without considering how it would look, how it would build the story of the man he wanted others to believe in. His charity was not born of compassion but of necessity, the scaffolding of a mask. Every act of help was a deposit into the account of trust he would later spend freely when he needed darkness to hide his work. He carried a Bible beneath his arm and knew exactly which verses soothed a widow's tears or which hymns softened suspicion. He did not believe in God's mercy. He believed in God's silence. That silence gave him room to act, to shape his rituals, to kneel in fields where no prayer ever rose heavenward but sank instead into the earth's black hunger. At meal times, Henry would serve stew to strangers at his table, bowing his head while steam rose from the bowls. He would close his eyes longer than necessary, savoring the stillness. To those across from him it looked like gratitude, but to Henry it was observation. He watched the way a traveler lifted a spoon, the weariness in their eyes and the looseness of their posture as warmth dulled their suspicion. In that moment they became more than guests. They became pieces on his hidden board, their names already rehearsed in his mind as future entries in the ledger locked away in his barn. He smiled kindly, even as he measured their weight, their strength, and the sound their breathing would make when pressed down beneath soil. The townsfolk praised him openly, telling each other that Henry was proof that goodness could survive hardship. They never saw the way his hands lingered when offering bread, or how his eyes drifted briefly as though picturing something beyond the table. No one questioned the precision of his life, the ritual regularity of his chores, or the way he always found time to serve others. And yet his own fields prospered as if labored over by more than one man. They believed his strength came from faith, when in truth it came from obsession, from the discipline of a mind that had learnt to wear innocence like a glove over something unspeakably dark. Henry's life was a balance, visible kindness to cover hidden cruelty, public service to excuse private ritual. He knew that suspicion rarely fell on the man most trusted, and so he cultivated trust like a crop, tending it carefully, watering it with generosity, letting it grow tall until it cast a shadow wide enough to conceal everything beneath. He moved among his neighbors as a man of light, but when the doors closed and the lamps dimmed, he belonged to the soil, to the hunger he had sworn to feed. And so the kindly hand that mended fences and ladled soup was the same hand that dug graves in silence, its nails blackened not with honest dirt, but with something far older and harder to wash away. In the back corner of Henry Kessler's barn, hidden behind stacked barrels of grain and the faint scent of hay, sat a chest that no neighbor had ever seen opened. Its iron lock was heavy, scarred by years of use, but the wood around it was polished smooth by Henry's own hand, as if he touched it often, perhaps even lovingly. To anyone else it would look like a place to keep tools or seed, the simple storage of a farmer's life, but inside lay something far different, a collection that revealed the true nature of the man who walked with such calm among his neighbors. Within that chest was a ledger, thick and weighty, its leather cover stained darker at the corners where Henry's fingers had lingered. The pages inside were not filled with accounts of corn or wheat, nor with prices or tallies from the market. They were filled with names. Each line was carefully written in Henry's steady hand, as if recorded with the same care a priest might give to sacred scripture. The names were often plain, drawn from men who passed through town, drifters who stopped for work, or women who vanished on the road between villages. Each name was followed by a date, sometimes the day of arrival, sometimes the day they were last seen. And beside many of them, etched with a sharp tool rather than ink, was a symbol. Circles, crosses, jagged marks that no one else would have understood, but that Henry read like harvest notes. Each mark was a code, a record not just of death, but of method. To Henry, the ledger was more than a record. It was a map of his life's true work. Every page was proof of what he believed he was building, the crop he was nurturing beneath the ground where others saw only dirt. The names meant more than flesh and bone. They were seeds planted into the soil that never warmed, offerings meant to feed its hidden hunger. Each symbol reminded him of the care with which he had chosen their fates. A circle marked those buried whole, pressed gently into the ground like bulbs in winter. A cross meant they had been broken first, their bones arranged deliberately to loosen the soil. Other marks were stranger, symbols of rituals only Henry understood. Designs scratched into the page with the same quiet devotion he gave to the bodies themselves. When he sat alone in the barn, the ledger opened before him. Henry felt a peace that he could not find in church pews or town gatherings. The barn became his sanctuary, the pages his hymnal, and the ink and scratches his liturgy. He turned the sheets slowly, remembering not the faces but the sounds, the last breaths caught in the soil and the muffled gasps that seemed to sink back into the earth and vanish. To others, death was the end. To Henry, it was the planting. The ledger was his proof that his work was ordered and methodical, not madness but purpose. No one in town would have imagined such a thing existed in the life of the man they praised as kind. If they had seen it, they would not have recognized the meaning of the symbols nor believed the number of names that filled the pages. They would have told themselves it was nonsense, a strange diary written by a lonely man. But Henry knew better. Every entry was tied to a body that would never be found, a voice that would never speak again. Each page was a graveyard bound in leather, a field of the dead harvested into memory. The ledger gave Henry something beyond secrecy. It gave him permanence. Crops failed, barns burnt, and storms swept away whole seasons, but the ledger endured. He knew that even if his own body fell into the soil one day, the book would remain, a testimony to the design he had carried out in silence. He often thought about whether anyone would ever find it, whether future eyes would open its cover and tremble at the realization of what each mark meant. That thought pleased him, the idea that his work would not end with him, that the soil's hunger would be remembered long after the town forgot his kindness. And so the chest stayed locked, the ledger hidden beneath barrels no one dared to move, while Henry walked through town with the same calm steps, the same soft eyes, and the same gentle words. They believed his life was an open book, but the only book that mattered was hidden, sealed with iron, its pages dark with the truth of who Henry Kessler really was. Henry Kessler believed that ordinary farming was nothing more than blindness. Men scattering seed across ground they did not understand, praying to a sun that often refused to answer. He told himself he had seen a truth others could not face. The soil did not want water alone. It wanted life. It wanted breath stolen at its surface and pressed back into its veins. His first attempts were quiet experiments carried out in secret corners of his land where no neighbor's eyes strayed. He began with animals because animals could disappear without stirring alarm. Calves born weak, dogs abandoned on the roadside, even birds caught beneath his nets. He placed them upside down into pits, forcing their heads into the dark earth while their legs kicked above the surface. He would cover them slowly, not too fast, allowing their last frantic movements to churn the dirt before it swallowed them whole. When the ground stilled, he would mark the spot with a wooden stake, and within weeks he swore he saw new strength in the crops that bordered those patches. The upside-down burial became a ritual repeated with care, refined each time. Henry believed the orientation mattered, that pressing the head into the soil first allowed the spirit to seep downward, feeding roots with something water never could. He watched closely for signs, inspecting each sprout for the color of its leaves and the firmness of its stalk. And when he saw the difference, when he saw his corn grow taller and thicker where flesh had been buried alive, his faith hardened into certainty. The soil, he told himself, was responding. It was acknowledging his devotion. But there were not enough animals. In Henry's mind, they were small offerings, no more than crumbs before a feast. If the soil could respond to a dog or a calf, what might it give in return for something larger, more complete? Something with words and reason pressed back into the dirt. The question haunted him until it became a need. A voice that whispered every time he passed the ledger locked in his barn. He knew better than to touch his neighbors. Locals could not vanish without notice. The town's trust in him was too important to risk. So he turned his eyes to the travelers who drifted through, men without roots, women with no family nearby. Souls the town would forget before the week was out. They were to Henry not people at all, but seeds already chosen for planting. The first was a peddler who knocked on Henry's door asking for water. Henry gave him bread, sat him at the table, and watched his hands tremble with exhaustion. That night he led him out to the barn, offering a bed of hay, but instead guided him further into a hole already dug deep in the field. Henry spoke gently, coaxing him to lie down, promising comfort. And then, with the same steady hands that had once lifted fence posts for widows, he bound the man's arms and pressed him upside down into the pit. The earth muffled his cries, his legs kicked like the animals had kicked, his shoes scraping the edges until Henry shoveled dirt across them layer by layer until silence fell and the ground was still again. When Henry returned weeks later, he found the soil looser, darker, and almost breathing beneath his boots. The corn in that row was unlike any he had seen before, thick as a man's wrist, with leaves sharp and green as if carved from glass. To Henry it was proof that he had not killed but planted. Proof that he was not a murderer but a farmer chosen to teach the land what it truly wanted. And so began his true harvest, one no neighbor would ever see. A harvest where flesh was seed and death was only another form of growth. Beneath the wide sweep of Henry Kessler's farmland, hidden from the eyes of neighbors and the endless gaze of the sky, there were chambers carved into the earth. He dug them himself night after night when the town slept and the only sound was the scrape of his spade against the soil. At first the holes were shallow enough to bury the animals he offered in the ground. But as his obsession deepened, so did the earth. The pits grew into narrow rooms, earthen vaults with walls pressed smooth by his hands, places designed not for burial but for ritual. To Henry, these chambers were sanctuaries, proof that the soil deserved more than casual offerings. It deserved stages upon which life could be extinguished with precision, with care, with meaning. The chambers were designed with thought that bordered on reverence. Henry left narrow shafts leading to the surface, long enough to reach above the fields, and into them he placed hollow reeds cut from the river bank. To anyone walking the land above, they looked like stray stalks, but to Henry they were instruments. Through them a body buried alive could still draw breath for a time. He would guide his victims into the chamber gently, speaking in the same soft voice he used with neighbors and widows, steadying their fear and convincing them of safety until the earth itself swallowed them. Once bound and lowered into the hollow space, their mouths found the reed, their lungs clinging to the thin gift of air. Then Henry began the covering. He shoveled soil slowly, never in haste, because speed was wasteful. Each scoop was deliberate, raining down across their bodies, rising higher with every moment. He wanted them alive as long as possible, wanted their hearts racing, their breath straining, because he believed that fear itself was food for the soil. A last heat released into the ground before silence claimed it. He listened carefully, tilting his head near the reeds, noting the rhythm of the breathing, the way it grew frantic and shallow as the weight pressed heavier on their chests. He did not look at their faces, he listened to their lungs. To Henry, this was music. And when at last the reed went still, when no air stirred inside it, he marked the moment in his mind, storing it like a farmer noting the end of a season. Each death was not an accident or a crime to him. It was a lesson. Henry believed the soil taught him through the chambers, showing him how long a body could cling to life and how terror carried deeper into the ground than calm. He recorded these lessons carefully in his ledger, writing not just the names and dates, but the exact moments when the reed fell silent and the minutes it took for panic to dissolve into stillness. His notes grew more intricate over time, like a scientist refining experiments, like a priest refining scripture. Every entry was paired with the harvest from the rows above, as though the growth of each crop could be traced back to the final breath that had seeped into the soil below. No one in town ever saw the chambers nor guessed at their existence, but Henry walked his fields with the serenity of a man who believed he was serving a higher law. To him, those who entered the chambers did not die in vain. They were part of something eternal, something the earth had asked for since the beginning of time, but no one else had dared to give. Henry did not see cruelty in what he did. He saw order, he saw sacrifice. He saw himself as chosen, the kindly man above ground and the silent harvester beneath it, working not for himself but for the land that never warmed. And when he closed his ledger each night, hands trembling with a strange peace, he knew that no sermon, no prayer, no neighbor's praise could ever match the truth that whispered to him from under the soil. On Sundays, Henry Kessler was the first to arrive at the small wooden church, his hat in hand. His Bible pressed close to his chest as though it were the anchor of his life. He walked the aisle with calm steps, choosing the front pew where all eyes could see him. And when the hymns began, his voice rose steady and deep, carrying the tune as if born from faith itself. Children sometimes wandered to him during the service, climbing onto his lap, and he held them with a patience that mothers admired, brushing their hair back gently as he followed along in Scripture. To the congregation he was a model of devotion, a man scarred by grief yet held together by God's hand, a man they trusted without question. No one wondered what those hymns stirred inside him, nor why the act of holding a child gave him a strange sense of stillness, the same strange calm he felt when covering the reeds of a chamber until the air went silent. To Henry, music and screams were only two notes of the same song, different paths to the same hush that always came at the end. His neighbors admired him openly, pointing to him as proof that suffering could shape virtue rather than bitterness. They told one another that Henry had endured the loss of his wife with grace, that his loneliness had only deepened his kindness, and that he lived as an example of God's will. Their words became his shield, their praise the perfect mask he wore. For while their eyes saw gentleness, his mind measured every moment with cold precision. He understood that suspicion never grew where trust was planted, and so he cultivated trust the way others cultivated wheat. Each verse he read aloud, each hand he clasped in greeting, and each prayer he murmured at the altar was another layer of camouflage over the darkness that ruled him. Henry did not fear discovery because he knew how well the mask fit. He moved through the town as if born for the role of a safe man, a harmless man, someone incapable of cruelty. He lent his tools freely, repaired fences, and pressed coins into the palms of children to spend on sweets after service. These small gestures built a story others were eager to believe, and once belief took root, no one thought to look deeper. Even when strangers vanished from the edge of town, suspicion never drifted toward Henry. Who would accuse the man who prayed longer than anyone else, the man whose door was always open? To doubt him would be to doubt their own judgment, and people preferred the comfort of certainty over the terror of truth. Yet behind his calm smile and bowed head, Henry's mind remained bound to the chambers and the soil. The hymns that others sang as praise he absorbed as rhythm, the steady rise and fall of voices reminding him of the last desperate gasps that filtered through reeds before silence. The children who nestled against him did not awaken tenderness but sharpened his sense of control, for he knew he could cradle innocence in his arms while carrying horror in his heart. He lived in that balance, the perfect split between light and shadow, innocence and cruelty. And so the mask held. The safest man to trust was the most dangerous. The most beloved neighbor was the most calculating predator. No one saw the truth because no one wished to. They wanted Henry to be what he appeared, and Henry understood that wanting was the strongest protection he had. While the church bells rang and voices lifted toward heaven, he sat still in the front pew, a man of faith in their eyes, but in truth a man of ritual, already planning the next offering for the soil that never warmed. In the silence of his cellar, Henry Kessler began a new devotion, one that grew from the soil of his mind as naturally as weeds rising through cracks. The chambers beneath his fields had taught him the power of breath, but now he searched for something lasting, something that could remain after the body rotted and the lungs collapsed. He found it in the mouth. Teeth, he believed, were the most honest part of a person. Flesh withered, bones softened, but teeth stayed behind, stubborn and unyielding, the last fragments to speak of life when everything else was gone. To Henry, they were seeds, proof that a person's spirit could be pressed into the ground not just through breath but through fragments that endured. When his victims fell silent in the soil, he would dig again, careful and patient, not to retrieve them whole but to claim their mouths. With a small blade he pried the teeth free, dropping them one by one into a sack that he carried back to his cellar. He arranged them not in heaps, but in careful rows across the packed earth floor, as if laying out a garden. Each tooth was pushed into the soil with his thumb, planted upright like a kernel of corn, and aligned with precision. The sight of them filled him with a reverence he could not put into words. Tiny white posts of memory breaking the dark floor, a field of ghosts sprouting in miniature. Every evening Henry returned to tend this strange harvest. He poured water over the rows of teeth, letting it seep into the soil, whispering to them as he did to his crops. He believed they would grow not into plants or stalks, but into something new. Life reshaped, life unimagined. In his mind, he was no longer just feeding the soil, but cultivating a crop that would rise beyond the hunger of earth and flesh. He told himself he was preparing for a future no one else could see, where the field that never warmed would finally give back more than corn, where the dead themselves might stand again, rooted in his care. To Henry, this was not madness but purpose. He convinced himself that he was keeping part of his victims alive, ensuring they were not wasted and that their essence remained useful long after their voices had vanished. He knelt before the rows of planted teeth like a priest before an altar, pressing his palm into the soil between them, waiting for a tremor, a sign that the earth had accepted his offering. When the cellar filled with silence, he imagined he could hear faint grinding, as if the teeth themselves shifted beneath the dirt, readying to rise. Above ground, Henry's neighbors still saw only kindness. They praised his generosity, his devotion, and his careful farming. No one imagined that beneath his barn lay a field of teeth watered like seedlings, each one a token stolen from a final scream. And Henry, calm and steady, lived between both worlds, the trusted man in daylight, and at night the patient farmer of a crop not yet seen by man. When the orphan train rolled into the small Nebraska town, it was met with the usual mix of pity and practicality. Children without families were seen as burdens by some and blessings by others, but to Henry Kessler they were something else entirely. They were seeds delivered straight to his door, unclaimed, unnamed in the eyes of the community. A gift of flesh no one would question if it vanished. He stood on the platform with his hat in hand, offering a gentle smile that melted suspicion. And when the station master asked who might take responsibility for two of the children too frail to attract eager families, Henry stepped forward without hesitation. The sight of him leading the boy and girl by the hand, steady and fatherly, drew nods of approval from his neighbors. They called it kindness, they called it charity. None could see the calculation that had already decided their fate before their small shoes touched his soil. That evening he set bowls of stew before them, watching the way their thin fingers clutched the spoons, the way hunger pulled their eyes downward. To them he was safe, a quiet man with a warm house. But as he cleared the dishes, his mind moved elsewhere, to the cellar, to the field, to the rituals that had begun to feel incomplete. The animals, the travelers, even the planted teeth, all had taught him something, but something greater still eluded him. He wondered what might happen if two lives were planted together, forced into one grave, two roots tangling, two spirits pressed into the same soil. Would they fight each other for breath, or would the struggle itself feed the earth more deeply? It was a question he could not resist, and now, with the children asleep under his roof, he had his chance to answer it. Before dawn, he led them out into the field, whispering promises of a game, of something secret they could share. The ground was already prepared, a pit dug deep, its walls damp with the night's chill. He bound their hands with twine, not harshly but with the careful restraint of a farmer tying stalks. They trusted him, their small eyes searching his face for comfort. He lowered them into the pit together, their bodies pressed close, and placed a reed between them, a single pipe meant for both mouths. They gasped at first, confused, then desperate, realizing the air they needed had to be shared. One drew in while the other starved, their breathing clashing, their bodies thrashing as dirt rained down over their heads. Henry knelt at the edge, watching, his expression calm, noting how long each struggled, how the boy's strength drained faster, and how the girl fought harder until panic made her teeth clamp around the reed, cutting off the last thin stream of air. The sound of their struggle faded beneath the soil, leaving only the muffled hiss of the earth settling. Henry covered the pit with patience, pressing the dirt flat with his hands as though planting tender seed. In his mind, it was not murder but cultivation, the merging of two lives into a single offering, a binding of innocence meant to teach the soil something new. He marked the spot in his ledger that night, adding not just their names but a symbol he had never drawn before, one that to him meant union, meant the crossing of two roots beneath the ground. To the town he remained the man of charity, the kind soul who had taken in the orphans when no one else would. They nodded at him with gratitude, never wondering why the children were no longer seen. And Henry, walking among them, with soft words and a Bible beneath his arm, carried inside him the memory of that pit, The gasping struggle, the last desperate breaths shared and stolen, and the sound of life being forced into silence together. It was, to him, a harvest, unlike any other. By the summer of 1889, the absences were no longer scattered enough to dismiss. A drifter who had been seen walking with Henry never boarded the next train. A pair of farmhands who shared stew at his table were never hired for the season they promised to work. A girl traveling alone vanished after resting on his porch, leaving behind only a satchel that no one claimed. The town began to whisper, at first in private, then in nervous clusters outside the church. They counted names, tracing them against the last place each had been seen, and too often the path circled back to Henry's farm. Still, suspicion did not settle on him the way it might on another man. His reputation was too carefully tended, his kindness was too deep in their memory. They wondered instead if the land itself was cursed, if the prairie swallowed the lost as easily as storms swallowed barns. One evening a traveling preacher passed through, warning the congregation of sins buried in the earth. He spoke of soil that drank blood and of fields that bore crops from the hunger of the dead. His words struck some with unease, and they turned their thoughts to Henry's dark acres, the ground that never warmed, and the shadows that seemed to cling there even in daylight. But Henry was present that evening, his head bowed, his voice steady in prayer. When the service ended, he placed coins into the preacher's palm and thanked him with a humility so convincing that others quickly laughed off the warning. Surely a man so steadfast, so faithful, could not be touched by such evil. And so suspicion faded back into silence, like mist burnt away by the sun. The neighbors continued to nod at Henry in the market, to trust him with their children during services, and to praise his fields even as their own faltered. They wanted to believe in his goodness because it steadied their world, because the alternative was too dark to accept. Henry understood this better than any of them. He walked home that night beneath the same quiet stars, his steps calm, his mask unshaken, while beneath his fields the soil rested heavy with the silence of those no one would count again. Henry Kessler had long believed that the soil listened, but by the autumn of that year he began to wonder if the sky demanded its own offering. Crows circled his fields more often, black flecks moving in restless arcs, and he grew convinced that they watched him, testing his devotion. It was not enough, he thought, to bury life beneath the ground where no one could see. A sacrifice needed to stand above the rows, visible to the sun and wind, a sentinel of flesh that would both guard and feed the land. His chance came with a wandering farmhand, a man strong enough to work, but poor enough that no one in town would remember his absence for long. Henry welcomed him with his usual softness, offered bread, water, and the promise of wages, then led him out into the field under the cover of night, where a rough wooden frame already stood waiting. Henry bound the man's arms wide across the frame, driving nails through rope to hold him firm, the wood creaking under the weight. The farmhand cried out, but the open land swallowed his voice, leaving only the wind to carry it. Henry moved with a farmer's patience, shoving dried husks and straw into the man's shirt, packing them tight into his body, forcing him to swell like the effigy of a harvest idol. The man thrashed weakly as the stuffing filled his chest and belly, but Henry worked methodically, ignoring the gasps and muffled pleas until the figure looked less like a man and more like a grotesque doll, stitched from flesh and stalks. At dawn, he hoisted the frame upright, planting it deep into the soil between rows of corn. To anyone passing along the road, it appeared only as another scarecrow, its outline swaying gently in the prairie wind. Children pointed at it from wagons, their parents nodding in approval of Henry's diligence. No one looked close enough to see the faint twitch of a hand, the slow drop of a head as breath failed. For hours the figure lingered, alive but fading, a living sacrifice fixed to the sky, feeding the soil not with silence beneath the ground, but with suffering made visible above it. When at last the body stilled, the crows landed in the corn, pecking at the husks that spilt from the seams of his clothing as though accepting the offering Henry had raised for them. Henry watched from the edge of the field with calm satisfaction. To him it was not cruelty but ritual, a completion of what he had always believed, that life could be shaped into symbols, that death could be bent into meaning. The man on the frame was no longer a laborer. He was a guardian rooted in both sky and soil, a harvest idol swaying in the wind, mistaken by neighbors for nothing more than a scarecrow. And in that mistake lay Henry's greatest shield, the perfect disguise for horror, hidden in plain sight. Anna Kessler had grown up believing her father was a man of goodness, a steady hand in a world that often bent under storms. She watched him read scripture, mend fences for neighbors, and offer bread to strangers, and though his eyes sometimes carried a shadow she could not name, she trusted his silence as proof of dignity. But children grow into curiosity, and one evening, while her father worked late in the fields, Anna wandered toward the barn. She had always been warned not to touch the locked chest in the corner or the cellar door beneath the floorboards. That night the warnings felt less like protection and more like chains. She pressed her weight against the door and found it unlatched, as though something meant to be hidden had invited her in. The air that met her was damp and sour, heavy with the smell of earth that had never seen sunlight. She lit a small lantern and descended, her breath unsteady as the flickering light revealed the cellar floor. At first she thought it was scattered stone or bone, white fragments breaking through the packed soil. But as she stepped closer, the truth struck her. Teeth. Hundreds of them stood planted upright in neat rows, pale and gleaming like crops that had sprouted in silence. Some were worn and yellow, others small and sharp like a child's, all arranged with a care that felt ritualistic and intentional. Water pooled at their roots where the soil had been darkened with her father's hand. The sight pulled the breath from her chest. Anna froze, her mind clawing for reason. Her father, the man who prayed longer than anyone, had filled his cellar with the mouths of the dead. She tried to imagine an explanation, but every answer made the horror grow deeper. The teeth were not trophies scattered in madness. They were cultivated, lined with the patience of a farmer tending crops. Each one seemed alive in its stillness, as if listening, as if waiting for the soil to finish what he had begun. She wanted to scream, but the cellar felt too heavy for sound. For the first time, Anna saw her father clearly, though he was not there. He was not a man of God, nor even the man her neighbors called safe. He was something else, something tied to the earth in a way that devoured faith instead of feeding it. She understood in a single crushing instant that the kindness he wore was nothing but a mask, that the prayers he whispered were never meant for heaven but for the black soil beneath their feet. Her innocence cracked like glass under a hammer. She fled the cellar, leaving the lantern behind, its flame casting long shadows across the pale rose that seemed to watch her go. Above her the night pressed close, and she felt the ground itself breathing beneath her shoes. She would never again look at her father with the eyes of a child. The soil had claimed him long ago, and now it reached for her too, through the teeth of the dead, through the secrets buried in their home. The rains came heavy that spring, rolling in from the plains with a hunger that matched Henry Kessler's own. Night after night the sky opened, pounding his fields with water until the ground softened and bled mud. At first Henry welcomed it, believing the storm would feed the crops as he had fed the soil. But then the earth betrayed him. The water cut into the land, loosening what he had buried so carefully, pulling secrets upward that were never meant to be seen. In the morning light he saw the first fragment, a pale curve of bone pushing through the muck between rows of corn. He pressed it back with his boot, covering it quickly, but the rain did not stop. By the next day more had surfaced, teeth scattered in the furrows, a rib bent like a broken root, and a finger bone that the crows pecked before he drove them away. Henry worked in desperation, hauling dirt with trembling arms, trying to hide what the storm revealed. He dug through the night, his lantern swaying in the wind, shoving fragments deeper only for the water to uncover them again by dawn. The soil he had trusted now turned against him, coughing up the remains as though rejecting his offerings, as though spitting out what could no longer be contained. Each morning brought more, and Henry felt the weight of time closing in. The neighbors were the first to notice when children found a jawbone near the fence line, its teeth still intact, pale against the black earth. The rumor spread before Henry could even reach the spot to claim it. Soon others found scraps in the runoff ditches, cloth stiff with rot, a femur gnawed by animals, and strands of hair tangled in the roots of corn. The town that once praised him now gathered in whispers at the edge of his fields, their eyes filled with dread. It was not sickness or famine they spoke of, but something older, something fouler. They said the earth itself had begun to speak, confessing what it had been forced to swallow. Henry moved among them with his mask still intact, his voice calm and his hands folded as though in prayer. He spoke of storms loosening old graves and of strange accidents carried by the flood. But his words no longer soothed. The fragments were too many, too fresh, too human. Neighbors who once trusted him with their children now stepped back when he passed, watching his fields as though they were alive, as though the soil itself might whisper their names next. For the first time in years, Henry felt the mask strain. He could not bury the truth fast enough, could not keep the earth silent beneath the weight of rain. The field that had once been his altar now turned into his accuser, raising its voice through bone and marrow, revealing to the world what he had labored so long to keep hidden. The town that once praised Henry Kessler as a man of kindness now dragged him in chains through its courthouse doors. The faces that once trusted him turned away, unable to meet his gaze. Yet Henry himself walked with calm, as if he were not entering judgment but attending another Sunday service. He did not resist, did not shout, and did not plead. He carried himself with the same composure he had worn at church pews, the same soft mask that had fooled them all for years. To the jurors, this quietness was almost more chilling than violence, as though the man standing before them believed he was not the accused but the teacher. There to deliver truths they were too frightened to admit. When questioned about the bones rising from his fields, Henry spoke without tremor, his words even and clear. He said the soil had needs that only he had learnt to hear, that he had devoted his life to feeding it what it asked for. He called himself not a murderer, but a farmer of eternity, a steward chosen by the land to sow a different crop. He described his methods with the patience of a man explaining ordinary chores. How the reed pipes allowed life to seep more slowly into the ground. How the upside-down burials fed roots with greater strength. And how the rows of teeth in his cellar were not trophies but seedlings of a harvest yet to come. Every word was delivered without hesitation, as though he had rehearsed it all his life. The ledger was placed before the court, its pages thick with ink and carved symbols. Jurors who had once known him as the man who mended fences now stared at names of the lost etched in a steady hand, dates marked with precision, and symbols cut deep into the paper like wounds, each entry read like the turning of a season. Sowing, waiting, reaping, silence. For every vanished drifter, every orphan unaccounted for, every farmhand who never made it to the next town, there was a line in the ledger, a life reduced to a record, a death catalogued as carefully as a crop yield. Some jurors paled as they read, others trembled, but Henry only watched them with calm interest, as if gauging whether they understood the devotion his work required. What unsettled the courtroom most was not the horror of his acts, but the steadiness with which he justified them. He did not deny, did not evade. He claimed his field had been barren before his offerings, and now it grew beyond its nature. He argued that the land was alive, that it needed life to return to it in order to give life back. He told them they had eaten bread and corn raised from that soil, their children nourished by the same roots that drank from his rituals, and in that way they were all already part of it. His logic was not frantic but deliberate, built like the careful rows he planted, each statement pressed into the air with quiet certainty. But there were no witnesses left alive to tell the court what it felt like to suffocate in his chambers, to gasp against another child for air, to thrash while husks were forced into a chest. The only testimony was Henry's own words, and the ledger that echoed them. The jurors listened, sickened and shaken, but justice without voices felt hollow, as if the dead themselves had been silenced too completely. Some said afterward that the trial felt less like judgment and more like a sermon given by a man who had already accepted his place in eternity. The verdict was inevitable, but even as it was delivered, Henry did not falter. He bowed his head as though in prayer, a faint smile touching his lips, as if the outcome mattered less than the seeds he had already planted. For he believed the soil itself had borne witness, and the field, not the court, would be the final judge of his work. The town could condemn his body, but the land would remember him, and in his calm eyes the jurors saw a haunting truth, that evil can sit in a pew, carry a Bible, lend a hand, and still walk into judgment convinced it has only fulfilled its duty. Henry Kessler met his end with the same calm that had carried him through life. On the morning of his execution, he walked to the gallows without resistance, his eyes steady, his lips moving in what some believed was prayer but others feared was something darker. A final conversation with the soil he had served. When the rope tightened and silence fell, there was no outcry, no struggle, only a stillness that unsettled the witnesses more than violence could. The town had its justice, but it felt thin, unsatisfying, as if Henry had surrendered nothing. His body was gone, but his presence lingered in the black acres of his farm, in the bones that still rested beneath the corn, in the ledger locked away as evidence, its pages thick with names and symbols that no one could forget. The fields were never plowed again. Farmers avoided the land, muttering that the ground was cursed, that it had been fed too deeply on the dead to ever give back honest life. Children were warned not to wander near, and wagons kept to the far road rather than cross the property line. Weeds rose tall and the house sagged into ruin, but the memory of what lay beneath gave it a permanence that fire or storm could not erase. To the townsfolk, the land became a ghost, a reminder that something unholy had once worn the face of a neighbor and been welcomed as a friend. They carried that knowledge like a sickness, whispering it across generations until the farm was not just abandoned, but forbidden. Years later, the case left scars that reached beyond the town. Laws were written with Henry's shadow pressed into their ink. Orphan trains faced stricter records, their children accounted for and traced to every new home, no longer left in silence where they could vanish without a word. Migrant workers were logged by name, their paths tracked so their disappearance would not pass unnoticed. Officials spoke of protection, but underneath the words lay fear, the unspoken memory of how easily the vulnerable had been devoured in Nebraska's fields without a trace. These measures carried Henry's ghost into courtrooms and government halls, his cruelty reshaping policy long after his body swung still on the rope. Yet the most haunting legacy was not the laws, but the reflection that lingered in the minds of those who had once trusted him. They remembered how Henry had sat in the front pew, children nestled on his lap, reading scripture with a voice as soft as any father's. They remembered how he had offered bread to the hungry, coins to the poor, and prayers to the grieving. They remembered how safe they had felt in his presence and how that safety had blinded them. The true terror was not the bones beneath his soil, but the lesson his life revealed. That evil does not always snarl or bare teeth, that it can wear kindness like a mask, walk among neighbors and smile while carrying a ledger of the dead in its pocket. And so the question passed down, whispered at the edges of the cursed land where no plow dared turn the soil. What if such a field could grow again? What if behind another gentle face in another quiet town the same hunger could take root unseen? The townsfolk did not answer aloud because in their silence lay the truth. Evil often hides in plain sight, waiting for trust to shield it, waiting for innocence to open the door. And if it happened once, could it not happen again?